Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter is not just a novel about adultery in Puritan New England. It is one of the most important works of American literature, a profound exploration of sin, guilt, hypocrisy, and redemption that continues to resonate with readers more than 170 years after its publication. Published in 1850, The Scarlet Letter established Hawthorne as a major American writer and created an enduring symbol in the Scarlet Letter A that Hester Prynne is forced to wear on her chest.
In today's video, we're diving deep into the dark world of Puritan Boston, exploring Nathaniel Hawthorne's complicated relationship with his Puritan ancestors and how it shaped this masterpiece, analyzing the novel's themes of sin and redemption, public shame and private guilt, examining its complex characters and symbolic richness, and understanding why this tale of a woman punished for adultery continues to speak powerfully to contemporary readers about judgment, hypocrisy, and the nature of sin.
To understand The Scarlet Letter, we must first understand Nathaniel Hawthorne himself and his deep, troubled connection to America's Puritan past. Born in 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts, Hawthorne came from an old New England family with deep Puritan roots. His ancestors had been among the early settlers of Massachusetts, and one of them, John Hawthorne, had served as a judge during the Salem witch trials of 1692. John Hawthorne was one of the most zealous prosecutors, sending numerous people to their deaths, and he never expressed remorse for his role in this tragedy. This ancestor's participation in what came to be seen as a shameful episode of mass hysteria and injustice haunted Nathaniel throughout his life. Hawthorne felt a sense of inherited guilt for his ancestors' sins, and when he began his writing career, he deliberately added a W to his last name, changing it from Hathorne to Hawthorne, symbolically distancing himself from his family's past while remaining connected to it. This sense of being implicated in historical sins that he did not personally commit, of inheriting guilt across generations, would become a central theme in his fiction. The Puritans fascinated and appalled Hawthorne in equal measure. He admired their strength, their conviction, and their role in founding American civilization. But he was repelled by their harsh judgments, their intolerance, and their self-righteousness. This ambivalence pervades The Scarlet Letter. Hawthorne's early life was marked by isolation and tragedy. His father, a sea captain, died of yellow fever when Nathaniel was just 4 years old, leaving the family in genteel poverty. His mother became a recluse, rarely leaving her room, and young Nathaniel grew up in an atmosphere of mourning and withdrawal. He attended Bowdoin College in Maine, where he formed important friendships, including with Franklin Pierce, who would later become President of the United States and help Hawthorne secure government employment. But after college, Hawthorne returned to Salem and spent more than a decade living in almost complete seclusion, reading obsessively, and learning the craft of writing. During these years of isolation, which he later called his solitary years, Hawthorne developed the dark psychological style that would characterize his mature work. He published stories in magazines and gift books, exploring themes of guilt, sin, isolation, and the hidden darkness in human nature. These early stories, later collected in volumes like Twice Told Tales and Mosses from an Old Manse, established his reputation as a writer of moral allegories. Stories that used symbolic situations to explore ethical and psychological truths. But he struggled financially and remained largely unknown to the general public. In 1839, Hawthorne took a job as a surveyor at the Boston Custom House, needing steady income. In 1842, he married Sophia Peabody, a painter and intellectual, and the marriage brought him great happiness after his lonely years. They had 3 children, and Hawthorne finally found a measure of domestic peace. However, Financial pressures continued, and in 1846 he took another government job, this time as surveyor of the Salem Custom House. This position gave him financial security, but left him little time for writing. When he lost the job in 1849 due to political changes, he was devastated by the loss of income, but liberated as a writer. It was in this period, after losing his custom house position and needing to support his family through his writing, that Hawthorne wrote The Scarlet Letter. He completed the novel in several months of intense work, writing in the mornings while his family was quiet. The story poured out of him as if years of observation, thought, and creative energy had been building up, waiting for release. When he read the final chapters to his wife, he was so moved by his own story that he broke down in tears. The novel was published in March 1850 and was an immediate success, selling out its first edition within days and establishing Hawthorne as America's leading novelist. The Scarlet Letter is set in Boston in the 1640s, during the early years of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, when Puritan religion dominated every aspect of life. The novel opens with one of the most powerful scenes in American literature. Hester Prynne, a young woman standing on a scaffold in the town square, holding an infant in her arms and wearing on her chest a scarlet letter A, intricately embroidered in gold thread. She is being publicly shamed for the sin of adultery. The entire community has gathered to witness her punishment, to judge her, and to hear the ministers preach about sin and its consequences. Hester must stand on the scaffold for 3 hours, exposed to the hostile stares and harsh judgments of her neighbors, and she must wear the scarlet letter for the rest of her life. The brilliance of Hawthorne's opening is that he makes us immediately sympathetic to Hester. The Puritan authorities and townspeople are portrayed as harsh, judgmental, and cruel. The women in the crowd are particularly vicious, suggesting that Hester should be branded on her forehead or even executed. The ministers interrogate Hester, demanding that she reveal the name of her child's father, but she refuses, choosing to bear her shame alone rather than expose her lover. This refusal, this protecting of another at cost to herself, immediately establishes Hester as having a kind of nobility and strength that her judges lack. She stands tall and dignified despite her humiliation, and the Scarlet Letter, which was meant to mark her as shameful, becomes, in Hawthorne's description, almost a badge of honor, beautifully crafted and proudly displayed. As Hester stands on the scaffold, she sees in the crowd 2 men who will be crucial to the story. One is an elderly stranger who has just arrived in Boston. Hester recognizes him with shock and horror, and we later learn that this is her husband, Roger Chillingworth, who had sent Hester to America ahead of him while he settled affairs in Europe but was delayed.
He arrives to find his wife publicly shamed as an adulteress with another man's child. The second man is the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, the young beloved minister of the community, who has been asked to exhort Hester to reveal her lover's name. Dimmesdale delivers this exhortation with particular emotional intensity, and careful readers will understand that his intensity comes from the fact that he himself is the father of Hester's child, that he is the secret sinner who hides behind his reputation for holiness, while Hester alone bears public shame.
The novel's plot is deceptively simple. After her public shaming, Hester lives on the outskirts of town with her daughter Pearl, supporting themselves through her skill with needle and embroidery. She is isolated from the community, marked by her letter as sinful, yet she gradually earns a measure of grudging respect through her charity and her skill. Pearl grows up as a wild elfin child, beautiful but strange, seeming almost supernatural, a living embodiment of her mother's sin and passion. Roger Chillingworth, after making Hester swear to keep his identity secret, becomes the physician to Reverend Dimmesdale and moves in with him, ostensibly to care for the minister's mysteriously declining health. But Chillingworth's real purpose is revenge. He suspects that Dimmesdale is Hester's lover, and he slowly, methodically torments the minister psychologically, probing his guilt and driving him toward breakdown. The novel's drama is primarily internal and psychological rather than external and action-driven. The real story is what happens inside the characters' minds and hearts as they deal with sin, guilt, and the choice between concealment and confession. Hester, having been publicly exposed and punished, has faced her sin and begins a process of redemption through acceptance and service. Dimmesdale, hiding his sin behind a facade of holiness, is slowly destroyed by secret guilt and hypocrisy. Chillingworth, consumed by revenge, becomes increasingly evil and twisted, his humanity eaten away by his obsession with punishing Dimmesdale. Each character represents a different response to sin and suffering, and Hawthorne uses their stories to explore profound questions about morality, redemption, and human nature. At the heart of the Scarlet Letter is an exploration of the nature of sin and guilt. The Puritans in the novel believe that sin is primarily a violation of God's law and that punishment should be public and severe. They see Hester's adultery as an absolute evil that must be exposed, condemned, and punished. But Hawthorne's novel complicates this simple moral framework. Who is the real sinner in the story? Hester, who broke her marriage vows but acted out of love, and who faces her sin with courage and dignity. Dimmesdale, who shares her sin but hides it, living as a hypocrite and allowing Hester to bear shame alone. Or Chillingworth, who commits no adultery but whose desire for revenge turns him into something monstrous. The novel suggests that secret guilt is more destructive than public shame. Hester, despite her Scarlet Letter and her isolation, remains strong, dignified, and capable of growth and redemption. She becomes more compassionate, more thoughtful, more truly good through her suffering. The letter that was meant to humiliate her becomes a symbol of her strength. People begin to interpret the A not as standing for adulteress, but for Abel, acknowledging her skill and her service to the community. Hester's openness about her sin, her acceptance of consequences, paradoxically frees her to grow morally and spiritually. Dimmesdale, by contrast, is destroyed by his concealment. He is praised as the holiest man in the community, held up as a model of righteousness, while internally he is tormented by guilt and self-loathing. He practices secret self-torture, whipping himself and fasting excessively, but these private mortifications bring him no peace. His health deteriorates, he suffers from heart trouble, he becomes increasingly unstable. The gap between his public image and his private reality tears him apart. Hawthorne suggests that hypocrisy, the maintaining of a false front while knowing oneself to be sinful, is more corrosive to the soul than the sin itself. Dimmesdale's tragedy is that he has allowed concern for his reputation, for his position in the community, to prevent him from honest confession and genuine repentance. Roger Chillingworth represents yet another form of sin, perhaps the worst in Hawthorne's moral universe. Chillingworth commits what Hawthorne calls the unpardonable sin, the violation of another human being's soul. His desire for revenge leads him to manipulate Dimmesdale psychologically, to probe his wounds and intensify his suffering, to play with him as a cat plays with a mouse. Chillingworth transforms from a scholar into a devil, his very appearance becoming increasingly evil and twisted as his inner corruption manifests outwardly. Hawthorne suggests that the desire to judge and punish others, to play God with other people's lives, is perhaps the greatest sin, because it denies the humanity and dignity of others. The character of Pearl is one of the most unusual and symbolically rich in American literature. She is not a realistic child, but a symbolic figure, a living embodiment of her parents' sin and passion. Pearl is beautiful but wild, refusing to follow rules, seeming almost supernatural. She is drawn to the Scarlet Letter, playing with it, decorating herself with plants arranged in an A shape, constantly asking her mother what the letter means and why the minister holds his hand over his heart. Pearl represents conscience, truth, the persistence of sin's consequences. She cannot be fully human, cannot be fully integrated into society until the truth is acknowledged and the sin is openly confronted. Only when Dimmesdale finally confesses publicly does Pearl kiss him and shed human tears for the first time, suggesting that truth-telling releases her from being merely a symbol into being a real child. The forest scene, where Hester and Dimmesdale meet secretly after years of separation, is the emotional climax of the novel. In the forest, away from the town and its judgmental eyes, they can be honest with each other. Hester reveals that Chillingworth is her husband and has been tormenting Dimmesdale. They discuss running away together, escaping to Europe where they can start over. In this moment of possibility, Hester removes the Scarlet Letter and lets down her hair, and she is transformed, becoming beautiful and alive in a way she has not been for years. Dimmesdale, too, seems renewed, energized by the prospect of escape. But their plan is doomed because it is based on continued concealment rather than confession, on running from consequences rather than facing them. After this meeting, Dimmesdale returns to town transformed, but in disturbing ways. He is filled with strange impulses to say shocking, blasphemous things to the Puritan townspeople. He wants to corrupt children and mock elderly believers. This psychological realism is brilliant on Hawthorne's part. Dimmesdale has been so repressed, has maintained such rigid control over himself for so long, that the prospect of freedom releases all his suppressed rebellion and darkness. He barely restrains himself from acting on these terrible impulses, showing how close he is to complete breakdown. The novel's climax comes during Election Day, when the new governor is to be inaugurated and Dimmesdale is to preach the election sermon, his greatest public moment. The entire community gathers, and Dimmesdale delivers a brilliant sermon. But immediately afterwards, instead of accepting the community's acclaim, he calls Hester and Pearl to join him on the scaffold. In front of the entire community, in the same place where Hester was shamed 7 years earlier, Dimmesdale confesses. He tears open his ministerial robes to reveal his chest, and the crowd sees there a scarlet letter A, branded or carved into his flesh, though Hawthorne deliberately leaves ambiguous whether this mark is real or psychosomatic, literal or metaphorical. Dimmesdale acknowledges Pearl as his daughter, accepts his sin publicly, and then dies in Hester's arms, finally at peace. This scene is complex and ambiguous in its meaning. Is Dimmesdale's confession and death a triumph or a tragedy? On one hand, he finally tells the truth, acknowledges his sin, and dies at peace rather than continuing to live in torment. On the other hand, he has waited until the moment of his death to confess, has allowed Hester to bear shame alone for 7 years, and his confession comes only when he has nothing left to lose. Is this genuine repentance, or a final act of self-centered drama, a way to control his own narrative and be remembered as a penitent sinner rather than a hypocrite? Hawthorne does not provide easy answers, allowing readers to interpret Dimmesdale's actions in different ways. After Dimmesdale's death, Chillingworth withers away, dying within the year. His entire purpose in life had been revenge on Dimmesdale, and with Dimmesdale gone, Chillingworth has nothing left. This suggests that revenge and hatred are parasitic emotions that require their object to survive, that a life devoted to hurting others is empty at its core. Ironically, Chillingworth leaves his considerable fortune to Pearl, the child of his wife's adultery, perhaps as a final gesture of twisted affection, or simply because he has no one else to leave it to. Hester and Pearl leave Boston and go to Europe, where Pearl grows up, marries well, and has a family. But years later, Hester returns to Boston alone, to the cottage on the outskirts of town where she had lived, and she takes up the Scarlet Letter again, wearing it voluntarily, though she is no longer required to do so. She spends her remaining years counseling other women who suffer, particularly those dealing with unhappy relationships or social condemnation. The letter has been transformed entirely in meaning. It is no longer a mark of shame imposed by society, but a symbol of wisdom earned through suffering, of compassion born from experience. Women come to Hester for advice because she has suffered and survived, because she understands pain and judgment in ways that those who have lived conventional, comfortable lives cannot. The novel's ending is ambiguous and thought-provoking. Hester has achieved a kind of redemption, but it comes at enormous cost. She has lost her love, her daughter lives far away, she is still isolated from normal society. Yet, she has found meaning and purpose in her suffering, has transformed shame into strength, has become wiser and more compassionate through her ordeal. When she dies, she is buried near Dimmesdale, and their graves share a single tombstone bearing the words, "On a Field," Sable, the letter A, Gules. The heraldic language elevates their story to legend, and the Scarlet Letter becomes their permanent memorial, a symbol whose meaning remains forever open to interpretation. The Scarlet Letter is notable for Hawthorne's use of symbolism. Nearly everything in the novel operates on both literal and symbolic levels simultaneously. The Scarlet Letter itself is the central symbol, but its meaning shifts and multiplies throughout the story. It begins as a mark of adultery, but it comes to represent Abel, angel, and even art. The scaffold where Hester is shamed appears 3 times in the novel, at the beginning, middle, and end, each time representing a different stage of revelation and acknowledgement. The forest represents natural law and freedom from social constraint, contrasted with the town which represents civilization, judgment, and repression. Pearl symbolizes the living consequences of sin, but also innocence, nature, and truth. Even colors are symbolic. Red represents passion and sin. Black represents the Puritan's severity and Chillingworth's evil. Gray represents Hester's penance and withdrawal. The novel is also remarkable for its treatment of women and its subtle feminism. Hester Prynne is one of the strongest, most admirable characters in 19th century American literature. She is punished for adultery while her male partner escapes public judgment, reflecting the gross double standard of Puritan and Victorian society. But Hester refuses to be destroyed by this injustice. She maintains her dignity, raises her daughter, supports herself through her own labor, and eventually wins a measure of respect despite her Scarlet Letter. She even reflects in one remarkable passage on the position of women in society, thinking that the whole system of social relations between men and women needs to be torn down and rebuilt on more equitable foundations. These thoughts are quite radical for Hawthorne's time, suggesting that he recognized the injustice of gender inequality, even if he could not fully imagine alternatives. Hawthorne's prose style in the Scarlet Letter is dense, formal, and richly metaphorical. He writes in long, complex sentences filled with archaic vocabulary and elaborate constructions. This style can be challenging for modern readers, but it serves important purposes. It creates a sense of distance and formality appropriate to the historical setting. It slows readers down, forcing them to pay attention to nuance and implication. And it allows Hawthorne to maintain deliberate ambiguity, to suggest multiple interpretations simultaneously without committing to any single reading. The novel is also famous for Hawthorne's use of ambiguity. He constantly presents events or symbols that can be interpreted in multiple ways, then refuses to tell readers which interpretation is correct. Did Dimmesdale really have a scarlet letter branded into his flesh, or was it psychosomatic or metaphorical? Did the meteor that appeared in the sky the night Dimmesdale stood on the scaffold really form an A, or did guilt-tormented minds project this shape onto random celestial events? Is Pearl genuinely supernatural, or is she simply a difficult child who seems otherworldly to her superstitious community? Hawthorne deliberately leaves these questions open, forcing readers to grapple with uncertainty and to recognize that truth is often ambiguous and multifaceted. The novel includes an introductory section called The Custom House, which purports to explain how Hawthorne discovered the story. He claims to have found, while working as surveyor of the Salem Custom House, old documents telling Hester's story and the actual Scarlet Letter, faded and worn. This framing device is fictional, but serves several purposes. It allows Hawthorne to comment satirically on his experience working in the custom house and on American politics. It provides historical authentication for the story, making it seem like a discovered historical account rather than pure fiction. And it establishes a narrative distance, with Hawthorne presenting himself as merely recording a story rather than inventing it, which gives him freedom to tell a morally complex tale without seeming to endorse all of its elements. The Scarlet Letter had an enormous impact on American literature and culture. It established the historical novel as an important American genre and showed that American writers could create works of psychological and moral complexity equal to European literature. The novel made the Scarlet Letter one of the most recognizable symbols in American culture, appearing in countless adaptations, references, and reimaginings. The book has been adapted numerous times for stage, film, and television, though the story's internalized drama and moral complexity make it challenging to adapt successfully. Each era tends to interpret the novel differently, finding in it reflections of its own concerns about sexuality, judgment, hypocrisy, and individual freedom versus social control. The novel continues to resonate with modern readers because its themes remain painfully relevant. The cruelty of public shaming, the destructiveness of hypocrisy, the double standards applied to women's sexuality, the way communities police and judge those who violate social norms, these are ongoing concerns. In an age of social media where people can be publicly condemned and their reputations destroyed for real or perceived transgressions, where shaming has become a form of mass entertainment, the Scarlet Letter's exploration of public judgment and private guilt feels more relevant than ever. The novel asks us to consider who has the right to judge others, what the purpose of punishment should be, whether public shaming reforms or simply destroys, and whether forgiveness and redemption are possible. The novel also speaks to enduring questions about the relationship between individual freedom and social order, between personal desire and communal norms. The Puritans believed that maintaining strict social and moral order was necessary for their community's survival, that individual freedom had to be subordinated to the group's need for righteousness and cohesion. But Hawthorne shows the human cost of this rigid order, the suffering inflicted on those who fail to conform, the hypocrisy of those who enforce standards they do not themselves meet. The novel does not offer simple solutions, but asks us to think about how we balance personal freedom with social responsibility, how we judge and punish wrongdoing, and how we decide what behaviors society should regulate and what should remain matters of private conscience. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter is a masterpiece because it combines a compelling story with profound moral and psychological insight. It creates in Hester Prynne one of American literature's great heroines, a woman who transforms suffering into strength and shame into wisdom. It examines sin, guilt, hypocrisy, and redemption with unmatched psychological acuity and moral complexity. It uses symbol and ambiguity to create a richly layered text that rewards multiple readings and supports multiple interpretations. It is written in prose that, while challenging, achieves moments of genuine beauty and power. And it addresses fundamental questions about human nature, morality, judgment, and forgiveness that remain as urgent today as when Hawthorne wrote the novel more than a century and a half ago. Thanks for watching this deep dive into Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of the foundational works of American literature, don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment below with your thoughts on The Scarlet Letter, how you interpret The Scarlet Letter's meaning, or which classic work you'd like me to explore next. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep exploring the works of literature that help us understand sin, judgment, redemption, and what it means to live with integrity in an imperfect world.